Cool.
Yep.
All right. Well, welcome to Roll Your Own HTML with Web Components. I am Raymond Camden. I feel like everybody here knows me, but for people watching on YouTube later, I am Raymond Camden. I am a developer evangelist for Adobe, working on stuff that, for the most part, I actually won't be talking at all about today. I have one small example that uses one of our things. But if you have any need to do any kind of document automation, like mass converting documents to PDF or PDF to Word or extracting data from PDFs, etc., I work on a team or with a team that has a bunch of APIs related to that. Also, if you have any follow-up questions and want to reach out to me, my blog is raymondcamden.com, and that's the best way to reach me since the great splintering of the social networks. I am not on Twitter much at all. I am doing Mastodon a bit, Blue Sky a bit less, Threads a bit more, but not participating as much as I used to. So good old email or the contact form on my site is probably the best way to reach me. And I love questions, so definitely feel free to reach out. All of the demos and the slide decks are up on a GitHub repository. So if you want to take a picture of the QR code, you're welcome to. Also, I'll make sure y'all have this link. And when you post it on YouTube, if you could put it in the description, I would appreciate that. But that's all there. I do have a lot of demos that will be on CodePen as well, but I link to it from the slide deck, so you'll still have an easy way to get to it. So my game plan today, how I'm thinking about talking about this is basically starting with the what in terms of web components, moving on the why, the how, and then talking about examples and talking about some next steps. I will warn you, there will be some soapboxing, theorizing, etc. type things. This is very much a slide deck that's under construction. I've been looking at this tech for maybe about a year now. It still feels relatively new. And it's also interesting because on like Mastodon, especially, and in the tech blogger space, which feels weird saying, there's a lot of discussion recently about this topic. So there's kind of a renaissance. And I am finding the way that I'm thinking about web components is definitely changing and kind of quickly. So that's all my way of saying, kind of keep that in mind that I'm going to try to focus on the tech, but there's definitely going to be some me giving you my opinions about how things are, and I fully expect my opinions to evolve over time. So let's talk about the what first. So in terms of what are web components, it is the ability to create custom HTML elements. So these typically will have a visual component, so that's both layout and style, and also typically some kind of interactivity. They are defined with JavaScript, and that is an important detail that I'll be talking more and more about as we go on. And first introduced way back in 2011. As we all know, or hopefully know, the web platform has been moving really, really quickly lately, maybe like the last 5 years actually or so. And support now is very, very good for web components. I would definitely say safe to use everywhere. There's one kind of major slash minor part that's not supported by iOS, and I'll talk about it, but it feels practically very unimportant. So I don't think it really matters that much. So in terms of what they are going to cover three core technologies or different specs, and that'll be the custom elements API, the shadow DOM, and HTML templates. So why? Why do we care about this? What are the use cases, etc.? And this is definitely going to be some of my opinion. So part of it is reusability. On the client side, we don't really have a way to package up a set of tags or, a set of interactivity, multiple things in a way and reuse them. And web components can give us that. It also allows for some consistency. So I am working on the internet for a large organization, and we need to ensure that we do things very consistently across a very large site. So web components can allow for that. Now, certainly things like CSS already do that. This builds on that and just adds to more ways that you can have a consistent user experience across your website. And also, I think you'll see this be big within frameworks and UI libraries. And this brings up an important point. There are definitely things in the web platform that I think are good features, but that are also not things that I think that most people will use. One example that comes to mind are JavaScript proxies, where you can write code that looks for manipulation to object properties and stuff. It's a very low level, powerful feature. And again, in my personal opinion, I don't see people like myself using that terribly much, but I see people who are building larger libraries like Vue.js, et cetera. I see them really relying on low-level stuff like that. And so that's not necessarily saying that web components absolutely fit in there, but I can see people like perhaps like Bootstrap, for example, adopting web components. And by the way, they have not adopted web components, or at least not since I've looked in the last couple of months. So how? Let's talk about custom elements. So basically, what happens in HTML when you have an element that isn't recognized? And I have a demo for that. And we're going to open it up. And I love when I leave notes to myself. Ray, open DevTools. And we're going to make this a little bit bigger. So this is a pretty simple website. Can one of y'all say in chat if my font sizes are okay?
Looks good here.
Cool, thank you. You see I have regular HTML elements, and I also have a foo element. And this is not supported. This is not a real thing, but my web page worked just fine. I could actually work with it via the DOM if I know how to type. Document query selector foo. And we'll do constructor. And this essentially is a HTML unknown element. So basically the browser saw something it didn't recognize, it slapped an object class onto it called HTML unknown element. From what I know, this renders as a div, and you can kind of see how it added white space, it's block, etc. But the browser did not break, which is the way browsers have tried to work, at least since the good old days. So how do we fix that? How do we actually make foo something recognized by the browser? We do this with the custom elements API. It lets you define an element. You begin with first a name. It has to be kebab case and it has to have a dash. I put that in all caps because I definitely made that mistake at first, not remembering the dash. My understanding is that the people behind the spec, they wanted to make sure that you always knew what was a custom element versus what was a built-in element as kind of a security practice and just organizationally wise. It also means that I could define an element and for some reason it enters, or something similar, enters the web standard specs, it won't conflict because mine has a kebab, has a dash, and the web standards one would not. You then define the JavaScript class. Now, I'll be honest, I don't do classes in JavaScript very often. It's just, I just don't. Maybe I suck for that. But when I had to, when I was learning how to work with web components, it was pretty easy. Now, to be fair, I've been introduced to classes before, so it wasn't completely new to me. But you don't necessarily have to know this extremely well to use it. I've even heard supposedly some people copy and paste code and run it. I know nobody watching this has ever done that, but you could do that. So this is an incredibly simple example where I'm showing an example of defining a tag, foo-cat. I point to the class that defines it. It has to extend HTML element. And this is the one part where iOS doesn't follow the spec. According to the spec for web components, you were also supposed to be able to extend and modify core built-in elements. So if you wanted to make a different kind of unordered list, you could extend, unordered list element, whatever the base class is. iOS doesn't support that. I don't think it ends up being that big of a deal. You could still build web components that output unordered lists and do, stuff with that. You just you can't rely on the underlying browser implementation of that. You have to build it yourself. But I mentioned, it's all very well supported. This is the one case, that one little edge case where you can't do that in iOS, and I believe Firefox as well. So within your component, you will typically do something. In this case, I'm just going to write to inner HTML. So I'm going to show you an example of this, and I will show you dev tools, and then I will show you code. But you see right here, I have a foo-cat, and it is outputting meow meow, and I have two of them. And if we look at the code, and again, y'all just warn me if this is too small. In fact, I will proactively make it bigger. Here is that sample code. I have my HTML, my JavaScript. And by the way, I feel like I have to say this every single time. Normally, I put my JavaScript in a different file. I do a script source, yada, yada, yada. When I'm presenting, I like to keep it as simple and direct as possible. Hence me having my HTML and JavaScript all here so you can see. This name here, foo-cat, can be anything I want. Again, as long as I follow the rules of kebab case and using a dash, it's fine. If I were to disable JavaScript, then nothing would show up, and these would act like an HTML unknown element and just show up as an empty div, basically. Excuse me. And in fact, let me just, you know what? I'm not going to disable JavaScript because then I'll forget how to turn it back on. So I'm just going to leave it as is. So that's the basic example. Let's actually make it a bit more complex. So regular HTML elements take attributes. Your components absolutely can do as well, and they can inspect them and react to them. So the code for this is the exact same code that you would use in your DOM. So if you use JavaScript to select a particular DOM element, you can run has attribute on it and get attribute on it to check for and read HTML attributes. So all I've done in this case basically is I defined a default value for a name. I'm looking for a name attribute, and if it exists, I grab it, and then I just render that out the string to inner HTML. And if we run this, we'll see meow meow said nameless the cat, and meow meow said Zelda the cat. Looking at our DOM tools, you could see there's foo-cat and there's foo-cat name equals Zelda. And we will look at that real quick, but it's basically what I just showed on slide. And you can do more here. So for example, if name was required, you could render nothing and do console.error or console.log. Hey, I couldn't do blah, blah, blah because you didn't pass a name attribute. I could also do a conditional output where maybe I output to the DOM a error there or show a good thing. It's, whatever logic makes sense for what you're building is how you would read and work with your attributes. You have options, which is always good. So as a more real world type example of this, I built a web component that wraps the place kitten image place image service that allows me to basically drop a place kitten tag in my HTML and get a picture of a cat. So I will show you that, and let me just make this a little bit smaller. You can see I have two cat images in my DOM. All I have is place kitten. I have one with a with and height and one without. And if we look at that code, again, it's pretty much what I showed on the slide deck, where I have some defaults. I check the values, get them if so, and then just render out the HTML. So far, so good. But we're going to mix things up a little bit. So I said this is the same as regular HTML elements, except that if an attribute can change and you care about that, you need to tell the component. And then you need to write whatever your logic is to handle that. So the way that's done is via a attribute callback. I'm sorry, let me start with the first one. It's to first add a getter for observed attributes. Basically, this web component is saying, these are the attributes that I care about if they change. You return an array of what those names are, and then you pair that with an attribute changed callback handler that will be passed the name of the attribute, the old value, and the new value. And then you do whatever makes sense. So if we look at this, I have two things here, and I am going to document query selector, and we will do place kitten, and I'll just confirm, make sure that it picked something. It did. And I will change the width to 900 if I could type, and it will do nothing because I did something wrong. Let's see what I did wrong here. Oh, I think I know what I did. I don't know what I did, but I'll show you the code and pretend it just worked anyway. So this is what I was talking about in terms of returning a list of attributes I care about, width and height. And then in here, I care, or I basically log out the change. And I'm going to try one more time to make that example work. And then I essentially took my HTML rendering stuff and just built it into a new method called render. So you see I use that in my constructor. And I'm also going to use it when I change values. So let's try one more time. This is why I rarely change things live. Let's see. 900, 900. And I'm definitely doing something wrong because it's not doing the console logback. But that is okay. It does work. Trust me on that. Let me look at my DOM here. In fact, actually, let's try changing it here and seeing what happens. And oh, it did work. We go on the console, and yes, it worked. So I must be writing my query selector wrong, but there's a console message, and it did actually re-render that out to the new size. If we go back into our DOM tree, we should see, yep, the URL for that placeholder service changed to represent the new width. Cool. So you saw connect. Actually, let me get these all out. Then I'll talk about it. So you saw attribute changed callback. There's three more that you could use as well. So connected callback is a method or an event that's fired when your web component is actually added into the DOM. Disconnected callback is used when it's removed. An example of when you may use that, if you have a web component that does something on an interval, like every second, maybe it fires off an AJAX request or does an animation, you can use disconnected callback to clear and remove that interval. Now, adopted callback is only used when a web component moves from one document to another. I have yet to see an example of that. I believe maybe if you move it from an iframe to the parent document, it's a thing. I haven't seen real world use case for it, but it is supported. And once again, attribute changed callback is the one that you saw me use already. So I want to point out one example where I have two web components, FooCat. One has an attribute, one doesn't. You've seen this work, so you know it works. But what if I instead want to use JavaScript? I can do this, right? I've defined what a FooCat is, so I should be able to create one and then add it to the child. But something goes wrong with it. And let me show you what happens. So we'll do CC fix 1. I'll drink some water. So in this demo, I have a web component. Let me show you the code. CC fix. I have a web component called FooCat, and then I dropped a button on there. And all that button does when clicked is create a new instance of FooCat and just append it to my body. So when I run that, something happens. Fail to construct custom element. The result must not have children. I'm going to show you the fix, and then I'm going to talk about what happened and how to correct it. So in the fix, what I've done is I've moved my logic out of the constructor and put it in the connected callback. And this actually corrects the issue. And the reason being, if we go back to the original, when I added a new FooCat, the constructor tried to read attributes, but it's not in the DOM yet, and it can't have attributes until it's added into the DOM. So that is what throws that error, and it's completely fixed by using connected callback. So the kind of net, and let me actually run this and make sure it does work, because I could be wrong. So we will add it, and that works fine. And we could also modify the name on the fly. So I'll reload that and add it, and it works. So the kind of net result from this is that I now do most of my work in connected callback, even if I'm not using attributes, because I may add attributes later, and I don't want to have to worry about it. Excuse me, and my constructor now typically is just calling super, which is required, and nothing else. I point this out because if you go to my blog and you go to my web components category and you start at the bottom, you're absolutely going to see a change in kind of like how I build this as I go along. And this is part of that exactly. And like I said, live and learn, right? So we covered one of the core APIs. The next one is the Shadow DOM, which sounds really cool, but it's not really quite that cool. It is essentially an encapsulated, potentially hidden DOM tree for your component. And what's kind of cool about that is that within this hidden shadow encapsulated DOM tree, the CSS of the outer document is not going to affect what you've done in there. And in fact, you could define your own CSS. Now, we've had this already. When you look at a couple of the special input types, they're all using Shadow DOM or something similar to that. I'm going to show you an example of that. If you have a web page that has, one of these special components, like the date one, if you go and inspect them, you could see there is a shadow root in here. And for that calendar control, there's all kind of wonky stuff in here. By the way, I should point out, you don't see this by default unless you go into your settings, and this applies to all Chromium-based browsers. In the elements preferences, there's one for show user agent DOM. I'm pretty sure by default that's turned off, and you would have to turn it on. But you can actually see how the browser builds input type equals date, and actually go in there and kind of poke around a bit. Same for input type equals color and other ones as well. So that's a kind of an example of how it looks in general. To use it in code, you begin by attaching a Shadow DOM to your web component. And then once you have it, you can work with it just like you do with regular DOM manipulation. So MDN, which is a great resource, typically they'll show examples where they will create an instance of a div element. And then they'll create an instance of a P element, and they will do P append child to div. And then they will work on the P element and append the text to it and all that. You can do all that, or you could just kind of Leroy Jenkins inner HTML the whole thing and just write to it directly, which I find a heck of a lot easier. So as an example of that, this is my foocat once again, but now I'm using the shadow DOM, and you can see it in the elements. When I open my foocat, I could see the shadow root in there, and in there I can see the code. Now I'm going to show you this. Shadow 1. I'm going to show you for an important reason. So this code, lines 34 or 35, that matches exactly what I showed you on the slide deck. You will see like 90% of the blog posts out there on web components use code like you see I have commented out here, where they will attach shadow and then take that result and save it to some variable and then use that variable and write to it. You don't need to do that, because as soon as you attach shadow, this class has a shadow root property that you can write to. So again, most blog posts you'll actually see still doing this. Mine do this until I realized that, and again switched over how I do this. So why bother? I talked about CSS leakage and using this as a way to stop that, and it allows me then to define my own CSS. So I'll show you an example, and then I'll show you the code behind it. You could see I have a couple foocats here, and I have a regular paragraph, and you see it's pink. And if we look at that code, I'll start up on top. I have a document level CSS declaration for my P tag, specifying the background color and the padding. My web component now has a style tag that I did using object notation. I mentioned again, MDN does that a lot. I specified my text content for my style. I then dropped that into the shadow root, created a P tag, and then added my text to it. And that then will ensure that the P defined externally doesn't get implied internally. And I'm pretty sure even if I don't specify a P, because I'm in the shadow root, it just will ignore the parent. I'm pretty sure. I'm not 100% sure. So let's test this and see. I just used an invalid selector there, P2, and yes. So even though I've not defined a P style, it's not picking up on the parent because I'm now using a shadow root, shadow DOM, I should say.
So one quick question, Ray, or I guess two questions. One is, would you be able to attach external style sheets to those custom components, those web components?
Yes, you can. So if you've seen dynamically adding like JavaScript via JavaScript, but you add like a script element, you could add a style element. No, I'm sorry. Add a link element, type equals style, or style sheet, or rel equals style sheet. I've always wished that they had added a style tag instead of the link tag. But you could add a link tag to the root body that points to your external style sheet. And you could potentially also do some logic to make sure you only do it one time, so you're not adding it multiple times.
And then the next question I have is, are those web components essentially in their own private space where other components can't, or other things, JavaScript or whatever, can't touch them, or are they still public? They're just in their own, like their own DOM that exists below that other DOM?
So in all of my examples, when I append the shadow root, I do mode equals open. If I do the opposite, which I believe is hidden, that's how rarely I use it, JavaScript can't get into it. So right now, via JavaScript, I could document query selector foocat and then query select the P inside it, I can dig into it. If I had set that to, I believe, closed, it would not allow me to do that. It would completely block it off. Now, the related question, I think, is, can components kind of talk to each other? A component can have an event handler, and it could also broadcast events. So you can have like child web components that broadcast an event that a parent web component is listening for and reacts to.
Okay, thanks.
So there are some CSS specific things that you could do in the Shadow DOM, and I just learned this like a week or so ago, so take this with a big grain of salt, but you can use pseudo selectors for the component itself. And what's nice is that, if I rename foocat to like goocat, host would still work. I could also say match a foocat that is only within a selector, or one that has a item beneath it. And I apologize, that was very vague. This one did not make a lot of sense to me, but I did try to build a good demo for this. And let me show you the code for this. So now my component is defining host, which should be itself. In this case, it's red. Host context block quote. So this should mean when a foocat is within a block quote. And then another one, okay, I kind of get it now. This will work, although I had the same thing twice. Yeah, I'm going to say I kind of broke this demo a little bit. In fact, let me do this real quick. Ray, look at this tomorrow. But if we go back up, you can see I have a foocat that's within block quote. And I have said that I want that style differently. I want that blue. And if we go back, you can see how foocat notices it's under there and styles itself differently. And again, because I'm using :host, I don't have to worry about the element being renamed to something else later on. So obviously, I don't do a lot of CSS, and it shows, but you do have some options to kind of intelligently style and respond your web component based on the context it is in. And certainly I need to play with this a bit more so I can speak about it a bit more intelligently. So HTML templates is the third and final aspect of it. It defines HTML and CSS that doesn't get rendered out. It can be cloned and appended to the DOM, and I don't like it, and I will show you why. And again, this is absolutely my personal opinion. But this is an example, and I'm going to show you the DOM first. The very first thing in my DOM is a template element, and I've given it an ID, and it automatically changed everything to a document fragment, and it is not being rendered. However, my code can make use of that. I'm going to show you the code behind it, and I took this from MDN. There's my template. And I have a web component, and it's going to essentially find that template, get the content out it, and then use that to render the web component. So on one hand, I think the logic here is if I want to write HTML, I can do it in JavaScript, but it can get a bit messy. If we go back to Shadow 3, my output is one line of code. That's very, very simple. If I had a very complex set of HTML, it could get a bit messy and it could be a bit nicer here. But the thing that bugs me the most is that this template now is littering, and I'll put that in air quotes, my HTML, my web page. If you had imagined that my web component was an external script source, that's what it would normally be. It's nice, it's encapsulated, it's away. If I have to drop this in here for it to work, that makes me feel bad. Like it feels like I've broken encapsulation a little bit. So I don't really see people doing this, and so I don't do it as well. But it is part of the spec, and it's FYI. And I built plenty of examples. I never used it. If you do differently, I would love to see why, and just let me know. So in terms of working with complex HTML, we actually have a nice way of doing that, and that's with slots. So this is a way for the calling document to provide more information to the web component. It can be both a default slot or a name slot. It looks like this, or slot name equals foo, and this feature requires use of the shadow DOM. None of this makes sense, but let me show you an example. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. I'm going to begin with profile 1. Let's switch to the code. I mean, on screen, you see a name, an email, and a bio. But if you look at the code for this, the way I did that was by using 3 attributes. So I have name, I have email, and bio is a very long string where I have to ensure that I don't have any double quotes. So I have to escape it or use single quotes. And so this works, but is not terribly nice. The slicker version is to use slots. And I'll show you the HTML first. So I have my web component, profile card. It still has some attributes, name and email, but I recognize that, bio is going to be like a lot of text, multiple paragraphs, pictures, whatever. And I just typed crap inside the web component. Now, the way this works is that when I use my shadow DOM, I can output slot and in slot, and the web browser will automatically take all the content between the beginning and end and just drop it inside. And I will run this just to make sure it works, make sure I'm not lying to y'all. And you can see there's my bio, multiple paragraphs, and my name and email. We can get more complex and have, and actually, let me show you one more example before I go any further. So I'm going to take this example where I have nothing between my tags. If I put text between slot, it works as default text. So if we go into profile 3 and where I've not defined anything, I get the default. However, one thing to kind of be aware of, if I hit enter, because I think, oh, that looks nicer, it's better formatted HTML, I'll save this, I'll reload, it doesn't work anymore. And the reason being is that now I've actually supplied something to my slide. I've supplied a carriage return. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when working with this, but also know that your slots can have some defaults. One more example. I will render this first and then show you the code. Now my profile is getting a bit more complex. I have, name, email, bio. I have books. I have jobs, etc. And what I've done is I have used name slots. So I have a UL element where I have said, hey, your slot is jobs. I have a P1 for books. And then everything else kind of just goes into the default slot. Notice I have jobs first and then books. Doesn't matter. When the web component is rendered, it's going to find those name slots. It's going to take them. It's going to rewrite it and just drop it in. And I don't necessarily even have to worry about what the initial order is. It's just going to work automatically. So slots are kind of a good way to me to kind of get back at what the template tag was doing, where I can have some HTML in my regular kind of portion of my DOM and then work with it within my web component. So I actually showed this already. I showed that earlier demo too early. That happens. So let's talk about some like real, and I put real in quotes, some real world examples of this, things that y'all can play with later. One of the first.
One quick question.
Yeah.
So with the slots and all that type of stuff, is it possible to get access to those slots or essentially anything that enter HTML just with JavaScript?
Yeah, that's not terribly easy. I have done it. I can't remember the demo offhand. Do this when we're all done. Remind me to come back to this because I did something where I think I had the same question and I was like, oh, can I just like reverse the text? You
Yeah.
can. It wasn't terribly direct. Let me keep going and let's go back to that and I'll show you an
Okay.
example of that.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I also want to put off because I get the feeling like you're not supposed to do that. But that's never stopped me from building stuff before. Um, So the Adobe PDF Embed API, this is a free JavaScript library we have that lets you put PDFs in your web document uh, in line with the rest of your page. So typically when browsers render PDFs, it's a full page experience. It's still very nice, but you lose the context of your website. Our JavaScript library lets you put it within your own site UI. Now, typically this requires a bit of JavaScript. So this is our default code where I have a div. I load in our JavaScript library, and then I write a bit of code. So I say, hey, I'm doing a new PDF view. It's pointing to this div, and I'm going to run preview file, point to a URL, and then render it out. This is the default. It's not hard. That's like 8 or 9 lines of code. However, I think this looks really, really cool, where I define a web component. I'll put it in a different library called a different file, pdfembed.js, and I literally just supply a URL to my PDF and the client key, which is something that we require. It's bound to your domain, which makes it safe to put in client-side code. And I'll show you this running. Minimize this a little bit so we have a bit more space. But this is our PDF embed, and the HTML behind it is incredibly simple. I mean, it's just that. And I could change that URL, and then all the code is behind here. And this one's a little bit complex. This is also a web component I wrote early on, so you could see a lot of stuff being done in Constructor. But all that complexity is now kind of hidden behind the scenes. I also take care of adding the script tag for you. Like I just drop it in there using a create element on script. Another example is placeholder. This is a placeholder component that does not use external image services. It just uses SVGs, which are not an image, but renders as an image. It's XML. But this allows me to have a component, a web component for placeholders that doesn't require an external service. This is how it looks. It supports width, height, background colors, and text. And I'll show you this example. And there it is. It's kind of boring, gray boxes, but that's what placeholders are supposed to be. You can see the words in there, and I could, change my text, and it should work as soon as I tab away. There it is. And all this is doing is creating a dynamic SVG. And you can see all that code there. And again, this is all linked to from the slide deck, so you can play with it. My third example, and this one is the one I'm most proud of. So you take a table, you wrap it in my web component, and it adds instant sorting. And if you don't support JavaScript, it doesn't matter because you still have a table. So by that, I mean, I take a table, T head, T body, etc., and I just wrap it with my new table sort custom tag, not custom tag, my Cold Fusion experience is showing there, web component, and it adds sorting. So I'll click on this, and yes, I'm okay, not saving changes. This is my web component and demo HTML table. And if I click on breed, if I click on age, the only thing that's a little bit different to this, I do support an attribute to specify numeric, because as we all know, sorting when it comes to numbers, we'll treat it like a string unless you specify that we should use numeric sorting. So my component has one optional attribute, and that is for what column should be a numeric sort. And I did one base indexing because that is sane. So some things to talk about before I really get on my soapbox. Form participation. Web components can participate in a form. And this just landed in Safari, but it's safe to use. What this means is that you can have a form, you can put a web component inside, and when you submit that form, the web component can have custom logic to say, this is how I'm going to expose my value to the form, allowing it to get packaged up and submitted along with regular form parts. I don't show this because I'm already like an hour in. This part of the spec was the only part that I found really hard. But I do have a blog post that you can look at if you want to play with it. There's also the idea of a declarative shadow root, which allows you to define a shadow root inside a web component. I have not worked with this much at all, but I can link you, as I have here, to a good blog post on Google's Chrome website talking about it. And even more bleeding edge, I've seen some people talk about the idea of not only defining custom HTML elements, but defining custom HTML attributes. I don't think this is even a spec yet. I think it's just been something that people have talked about. I saw a grand total of one blog post on it, but it sounded really interesting, and it may be something we see in the future. Now, there are a lot of libraries to do web components easier. I have avoided all of them. I wanted to learn how to do web components, the hard way, uphill, both ways in snow. And again, like I was really surprised to find out that it wasn't too hard to work with for the most part. So I have still avoided using web component libraries, and also I tend to avoid build steps in general. I will say, I feel like I've kicked the tires on web components enough where I'm ready now to play with them. I'll give a special shout out to Spectrum, which is an Adobe project. So Adobe definitely still does web stuff, and Spectrum is actually really kind of nice looking. There's also some interesting alternatives that take the idea of web components and put them on the server. So for example, WebC is part of a Levany. Levany is a static site generator. And WebC essentially allows you to write web components, but they are converted to just regular HTML and a little bit of JavaScript when you do your site build. And this brings up a really kind of big topic that I'm going to try to encapsulate in a couple of minutes. When I first learned about web components and first started playing with them and first realized how easy they were, one of my first reactions was like, oh, we should do this everywhere. And I, went to Bootstrap, as I thought, that'd be a great example where I like Bootstrap, but every time I use it, I have to, keep the reference guide open because their tabs, they're nice tabs, but it's like div class equals tab group, and then another div that's class equals tab, and then div class equals tab title, and that's not hard. But in my mind, I was like, oh man, it would be great if we had like a BS-tabs web component, and underneath that a BS-tab with a title attribute and my text inside that naturally mapped to the tab text. So yes, you can do that, but keep in mind what you're doing now. You have made it easier for you to build that UI, but you've actually made it slightly worse for the end user because now before they see anything, they need Bootstrap CSS to load and their JavaScript, and they need your JavaScript to load as well. And it may not be a lot of JavaScript, it may be a little bit of JavaScript, but I think anytime you do something for the developer that adds anything at all to the end user, you should at least really be aware of what you're doing because that crap adds up. And that's how we end up with 100 meg web pages that take forever to render. So I'm not saying that as, oh, I'm never going to use web components again. it's absolutely kind of made me think first before using them. Also, I'm really excited about the idea of web components that only progressively enhance. So I think my table sorting component is a great example of that. If you're on a very slow network where my JavaScript perhaps doesn't load for a minute, then that's okay because you still have an HTML table. You still see it. Like you are losing nothing. My web component only progressively enhances it when it can. So that's kind of where my mind is thinking about, using web components in general, at least now. And you're also seeing people on the socials, and I hate saying on the socials, it sounds so blah. Uh, but people have been talking about quote unquote HTML web components, which are web components that are wrapping HTML that render just fine and work just fine. And the web components make it a bit better. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as you get into it. Some resources. MDN, I adore MDN. It's the best resource out there. I will say I struggled with their web components docs in general. I love them, and this is one area where I felt they failed me personally, where the docs didn't work as well, and I should do the right thing and try to help and submit a PR and all that. I just throw that out as a warning that maybe it'll be hard for you as well. I still go to MDN every single day, multiple days. Webcomponents.org and Open Web Components are both websites that just good resource sites. And also, because I'm on screen here, my coworker, Ben Farrell, wrote a book, and I'm gonna make sure Web Components in Action. Ta-da! This is a couple years old. I have found maybe one thing that I would consider wrong, but that does not stop the book from being something that I would recommend and buy. So buy the book. It will help Ben out as well. So definitely check it out. There's also a lot of examples out in the wild. I assume that most people have heard of YouTube and GitHub. If you actually go there and look at stuff, you will see web components, dev.to as well. And there's actually a Chrome extension that will highlight when a site is using web components and let you look at them. And I don't think I have it installed in this profile, but here it is. Visit the new store now, but it still works. But again, actually, here we go. I do have it installed. Let's go to GitHub real quick. And you could see it highlighted, and it's telling me the web components on the page, and they're actually using it quite a bit. And you could click, and I believe it scrolls to it, and just as like a good discovery tool, it's a way of knowing about web components in the wild. That was a lot of talking. So I will open it to any questions. And if we have no questions, then Nick, I will try to discuss what you asked me.
Are there any questions from members of the group? If you are a guest, you can feel free to put it into the chat and we'll make sure we relay it.
Going once. Web components. I'm going to take that as a no, Nick, if you agree.
Yep, not seeing anybody type either, so.
Cool. So I will share, this is my my blog post on web components. Again, you'll see like the progression as I learn stuff. So Nick, I definitely did this. I did it a couple of times. So I believe this one, where I was curious if we could show or hide slide content. Yeah. So yeah, I wanted a web component that would wrap a random Ajax loading thing and allow me to kind of easily define HTML for the various states. And for that, Yeah, already I see attempt 1, so that means I was doing something. Um, I got it working, I believe, and I'm trying to find the exact code. I was able to query select it. I'm very hesitant on this, Nick, because I feel like I did this, but then like it failed later in a different example. But that's one example. And I also use it in a slideshow I built where, no, I'm sorry, I did not show it there. I've done it at least once. So I would say look at that example, and there may be another one in here buried as well.
So what I found kind of interesting too is the table example that you had. Kind of does what looking for, because you are accessing that content within it and all that stuff. But it looks like you're just doing a query selector for tables, so it should work with any table on the page too. So
Yeah, I forget. So I think I really tried to do like a reverse component, like just reverse the text inside. I remember it being hard.
yeah.
Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't as hard as I remember.
Ray, I also like the table selector component quite a bit. Is there any website you could recommend where there's like a utility website where there's a whole bunch of tags people have put out there? You need to do something, you can kind of skim it. And
Yeah. I honestly have not been to webcomponents.org in a while, but they have elements. I'm not sure how many. Oh, 2,000. There you go. I'm going to stop there.
that sounds like that'll do it. Because I should be using some of these and I'm not. And so, gosh, if you had a page component, then you'd be perfect, like page 2, page 3. That's always a bitch for me anyway, getting it going. Cold Fusion and now in JavaScript, so use somebody else's.
Yeah.
And I think that browser, being able to look at what the professionals at GitHub or Google or whatever they're building, and I bet there's some gems in there.
Absolutely. Yep.
Great. Anybody got any other questions or comments they want to make for Ray?
I got a question. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what's the difference between writing your own library of web components versus using a library like Beautify.js? What's the difference? Why go that route versus why not go that route? Like, are they building web components under the covers, and then, what's going on there?
So I think the argument for me for using a web component is portability. So in Vue, I could definitely have a single file component that I could reuse amongst my app, but getting that outside of that app would be difficult, right? I'd have to copy it into a new Vue application. I couldn't use it in React, for example. So I think not being tied to Vue and being able to port it to something else would be an argument for. Also, in a application like Vue or React, whatever, if I were on this site, I could get a custom web component and still use it, right? I would just include the source and use it in my application. Did that answer your question, or?
Yeah, no, I think so.
All right.
Also, I think in cases like Beautify, which I've used, you may not have everything you want to do, and create your own. You can use it wherever, whether you're using a Beautify or some other JavaScript library, even if you stay in the Vue realm.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, like, I'm in a Vue app and I spent time building a profile card component. Like, oh man, I can't convert it to React. I think it's fair to say like that may not happen very often, and it wouldn't be that hard if most of my work was in the HTML and CSS, and the view part was just defining the single file component, practically it may not be that big of a deal. But I think that's still kind of the argument I would think of as why, you would go for a web component versus something specific for your JavaScript framework.
Yeah, one of the concerns that I've been exposed to is just the, seems like a library like Vue, has 10,000 dependencies on 10,000 other libraries that have 10,000 dependencies on other, it's like a dependency nightmare, and trying to move from one version to the next, or trying to even, sometimes, I mean, it seems so simple. Just, I want to update to the latest version of this one library that I'm using, and it just creates a nightmare.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to lean on Vue all the time, but now I try to just do vanilla JavaScript, or if I feel like I need a little bit more, Alpine JS is really lightweight, and that's like my next my first framework of choice would be Alpine. If there's nobody else, I'm gonna go to
Any other
dinner.
questions?